There we go. That should be done too. Thanks for reminding me. So, as said, we will take a communication perspective on the theme of this year's fellowship in the CMM Institute, and we'll say a bit more about that, of course, before we do that. So we will first set the stage and hold the space as a small group of board members from the CMM Institute. And then we will give our fellows the stage to share a bit about their work as part of the fellowship. And then I will ask my fellow board members to start some questions in dialogue with them before we open up the breakout rooms, because there's so many of you, we've chosen to break out in small groups so that each of you can also interact with each other around the ideas presented and discussed so far at that point. And as a final point, we'll come back and share some reflections, try to synthesize around the ideas and wrap up our session for today. So that's our plan. My name is Sergej Middendorp. I am an alum of Fielding School of Human and Organization Development. And I'm also a board member of the CMM Institute, which I will introduce shortly. And I will ask each of the fellow presenters to briefly introduce themselves once their turn is in the program to keep us going. So let us start with the introductions. The CMM Institute was founded about 10 years ago at Fielding Graduate University to continue the work in CMM and to offer a place from which we can steward that work, which had been going on over the course of 40 years at that time. A large part of which in the context of Fielding, where Barnett Pierce, one of the co-founders of CMM, taught until he passed. And some of us here on the call had the great privilege to be learning with him while he was teaching at Fielding. But CMM, and I'll skip back to the slide before, CMM actually emerged in the 1970s at the University of Massachusetts in the communications department, with Barnett Pierce, Vernon Cronin working closely together with their PhD students to think about how communication, systems thinking, social construction, Buberian dialogue, and other more complex takes on communication could together help to create tools that we could use to look at communication as a substantive, as an objective force in and of itself, something that creates our social worlds. And the photograph in the backdrop of this slide is a picture of the Blue Wall Cafe at the University of Massachusetts. Today, I guess in the 70s it looked a bit different, but it still has the same name. And over lunch, Barnett, Vernon, and their students would sit at their tables, drawing the ideas on napkins, sharing them, and many of the early ideas of CMM were in that way given form. So as a tribute to that early founding story, which we only learned a few months ago during a learning exchange, we've created this template that reflects the idea of being in the Blue Wall Cafe, drawing our ideas on napkins. And that is also a metaphor that I hope will transpire through our session today. But going back to the introduction of CMM, the CMM Institute sees that the ideas that CMM has developed could make a contribution to some of the complex problems that we are facing today in our world, help us transcend, look at these problems in a different way, and help us by doing that transform ourselves and our social worlds. That is a big ambition that we try to make practical in projects and initiatives that the Institute facilitates. I've taken 3 examples from what we do, and of course our fellowship program is one of them that we will have center stage today. But one of them is our website, which collects papers, books, tells about all our initiatives, and is a good and timely resource if you want to explore further. Another project is Cosmopolis 2045, where we try together with researchers, practitioners, to imagine a world in 2045 where these ideas about communication have become mainstream. We will still have issues, problems, but how do we deal with them differently if we assume that CMM is a normal way of looking at communication? And third, I want to highlight the Cosmo Kids project, where the ideas of CMM have been used to create sets of cards that teachers, kids, and parents can use in different age groups to talk about difficult situations in the social lives of children, and to play out these situations using CMM in a playful way so that they become empowered to see more possibilities in the moment for acting into these difficult situations. And of course, we'll share this presentation, and if you want to explore further, you can click on these images later to explore the websites that tell you more about these initiatives. One initiative that I also want to highlight is our recently founded CMMI Press, through which we publish recent work in CMM. There's a lot of published work in CMM before this press was founded, which you can also find through our website. But these are two very recent publications that we want to highlight and share with you as possibilities to learn more about our work. So for a brief introduction, I'll leave it to that, and I'll hand over to Ilene to say more about the fellowship program that is centered to our session today. Ilene?
Thank you, Sergej. I feel like you just were the person welcoming us into the cafe for some really wonderful conversations today. And as I was anticipating seeing you all today, I was looking back into our archives about the roots of the Fellows Program. And the Fellows Program was inspired as a way of creating an ongoing flow of exploration, of taking a communication perspective in projects that treat communication, as Sergej said, as important in its own right and around creating better social worlds. And so each year we select a topic or a theme, and we invite people to apply to be a CMM fellow. In the early years, we did this in collaboration with Fielding, and we did it in collaboration with Villanova. And we have continued to do this in collaboration with Columbia University, as Beth will address. And what has happened is that over the years, we have built a community of people who are out in the world doing amazing projects that are both research, action research, and reflection and action, with the following criteria: that they are a scholar practitioner, meaning that the work that they are doing is informed by theory, and that they are joining the conversation as you all have in your work, and as people who are informing their work through scholarly practice. And that they demonstrate an understanding of what it is to take a communication perspective, and that they are using that perspective to address real world challenges. And what I am been involved with and have made CMM part of my work since my being at Fielding. Barnett Pierce was my chair of my dissertation committee, and I graduated in, I don't really, whether it was 2004, 2005 actually. And that I have continued, I have to say, to grow and thrive by being part of this amazing community and in relationship to these fellows. And Bart Buechner has done an amazing job of really leading this process. And I feel honored to have been partnering with him along the way. And so I am going to turn it over to Beth, who's going to talk about how AC4 at Columbia University has joined us every year in this expanded community of people doing amazing work in the field, informed by the communication perspective.
Thanks, Ilene. So hi, yes, I'm Beth Fisher-Yoshida. I graduated Human and Organizational Systems in 2000. And since I first encountered CMM at Fielding in the 90s through Barnett and others, it's become more and more integrated into the work I do and into my life. And I'm a professor of practice at Columbia. I direct a master's program in negotiation and conflict resolution. And I'm also the executive director of AC4, which stands for the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. We have a lot of C's in our acronyms. And so one of the reasons I think it's so critical to offer these kinds of fellowships is because it gives people, such as students who are all different ages, all different backgrounds, an opportunity to join this kind of a community. It's an opportunity to bring CMM into the work that they do. And even though my areas of interest are a lot with conflict transformation and women in negotiation, their work ranges all over the place because it's across the university that we offer it. So it's not just from a conflict resolution background. And the other thing is that I think as an educator, which I've been my whole life, I realized one day, as an educator, I think one of our responsibilities is to provide opportunities for students to see what's out there in the world and what kind of a difference they can make and how to expose them to different opportunities and different learning paths. And that's one of the things that this fellowship has been able to do. And so CMM has become more and more integrated. It's definitely integrated very well into the negotiation and conflict resolution program. People use it as a form of conflict analysis. They use it for monitoring and evaluation. They use it to show the ways in which narratives can be transformed and so on. So now that's enough about that. I'm going to turn it over to Bart.
Okay, well, thank you, Beth. I have my own cocktail napkin here, as this has been a very interesting conversation so far as we trace the history of the evolution of the Fellows Program over 10 years. And it's really stayed very close to its original intentions, but it's also become a little bit more refined and a little more interactive. And this year, we really made it a point to try to set up a space so that the Fellows could actually co-construct the experience of being a fellow along with us and not just have us kind of deliver some predetermined type of structure. And it's been a lot of fun to do that. I graduated from Fielding in 2014, and I work at Adler University presently in a program directed towards military psychology. And I have discovered since doing that over the last 6 years that Adlerian psychology, for those that aren't familiar with it, has a lot in common with CMM in the sense that it has social constructionist roots. And that is to say that Adler was a colleague of Sigmund Freud who shifted the focus in his work in the field of psychology from what goes on within to what goes on relationally in the environment with in communication with other folks. And so the notion that our mental well-being, our physical well-being, and our ability to co-construct a reality that we all feel comfortable in are very strongly interrelated. And the work that I do, again, mostly with military veterans trying to re-acclimate themselves or re-assimilate after a fairly intense, in most cases, experience of being outside of mainstream culture has pushed that to the limits in a lot of ways. I want to pick up on a couple of words that were used earlier, or concepts earlier, and one was we talked about the bridging of polarized narratives. And if I could ask a question around the group, I would be interested to see how many people are here specifically because of their interest in that topic. And it doesn't take much imagination to see why it's relevant today with all the C's that Beth just mentioned, particularly because we've got a lot of C's going on out there. So we got to learn how to navigate the seas. As a Navy guy, I appreciate that. But one of the words that Barnett used in his writing and occasionally and in his conversations was polysemous. And I had not seen that word before I encountered Barnett. And that word, it basically comes out of the field of communication, and it's about words that mean more than one thing in different contexts or to different people. So we live in a polysemous world, and we don't necessarily make the same reality or make the same meaning out of the same words. And as a process of thinking through that, Barnett laid out what a theoretical base of what we call cosmopolitan communication. So that is the sense that we make meaning within a cultural framework, and if we're in a monoculture, then everybody makes sense because everybody's coming from the same framework. So we don't need to worry about being polysemous. It's all there. Then we evolve up to an ethnocentric level of awareness where we know that our reality is the best one, but there's some other ones out there. It seems like a lot of people in the United States have fallen into that one, unfortunately. And then we get better over time. We evolve awareness of others and respect for others in the sense that we can engage in modernistic communication. So we're capable now of respecting differences and engaging differences, but somehow we haven't achieved either equality or equity, depending on which word we're using. And we're now experimenting with both of those words in our public discourse, which could be helpful in the long term. But Barnett envisioned something beyond that, which he referred to as cosmopolitan communication, where we're able to embrace, respect, and engage across levels of cultural similarity. We can get out of the mode of making our decisions based on feelings of coherence and to engage in forms of coordination that cross over. And by doing that and creating that space, we create room for the emergence of that which we can't foresee or control, which he termed mystery. And so one of the things that Barnett taught us to do is to try to create conditions in which we could create space for mystery as a higher level of context. And so that is not always easy to do. Our fellows have found several ways to do that. And I think the last word I wanted to mention here is Sergej mentioned the CMM as being a normal way to look at communication. And I'm going to turn that on its side a little bit and say one of the things we have to do is to use CMM to create some abnormal ways to look at communication. And Barnett referred to this as abnormal discourse. And that is to say that if you are in one of these ethnocentric or monocultural contexts and somebody else comes into it and then doesn't respond in the way that we expect, the way that we can make connections with them is to appreciate, embrace, and be able to navigate abnormal discourse where we don't necessarily have to follow all the rules all the time, and we can get into a space where we are improvising, and that is creating something together or co-creating something together that follows this flow of both following and breaking rules, kind of like we do in jazz improvisation. I think that's probably a good time to turn it over to Sergej and Rick, unless there was a need at this point for me to introduce the fellows by name and talk about what their topics are. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to do that or not.
No, Bart, that's fine. And thank you for that beautiful both overview, but also some in-depth peek at ideas that Barnett and others in our community developed, and the bridge to improvisation. Because indeed, that is something we want to highlight as another metaphor to offer you as you go through the rest of this session. So a recent development in the CMM community in terms of research and practice is the role of metaphor. And this, for the purposes of brevity here and now, goes along two dimensions. One is that metaphors help us to create coherence between concepts, highlighting certain aspects of concepts while hiding others. And the other is that metaphor from a cognitive perspective also opens up the connection between the mind and the body and the environment, so that communication does not remain a cerebral, meaning-focused, thinking-only activity, but also becomes an engaged, embodied, and relational way of being and becoming in relationship with the other and the natural environment. And that expands the idea of CMM beyond the usual or normal way of perceiving the meaning of communication. So, as you may have seen in the overview of our fellows' topics, and you will learn later when they present themselves, many of them use metaphors to give coherence to their work, or to highlight certain aspects of what they want to say about this year's theme. But building on what Bart said in terms of improvisation, that is an embodied activity, and improvising with metaphors helps us to sort of shift meaning and change coherence. But before I rant on about metaphor and improvising with metaphors, I want to hand over to my colleague Rick, who will support us with an embodied experience of jazz as a metaphor, while we look at the minimal structure that that Miles Davis provided for the flamenco sketches recording of Kind of Blue, which is literally this scrap of paper with a few notes on it that no one had seen before. They recorded this and printed it on the album that became one of the best-selling jazz records ever. So, having said that, Rick, over to you.
Hi, everyone. 2 words around me. I'm serving at the board of the CMM Institute, and I'm working mainly, I'm an applied musicologist, so I'm working from the perspective of music. And the metaphor of music, art, the irrational, sound, jazz, improv, everything that's connected with the audible, things you can hear, as an addition to more visual metaphors that might be more foundational or more happening in traditional ways of looking at communication, organizational stuff. And I want to play with this thing a bit. Got this guitar here, and I'm going to show you this little sketch. Just imagine that you can see this A7. Just imagine this is the structure I have as being a musician, and they say, okay, this is your part. You might imagine a whole score with all kind of notes, and I have to exactly play like all kind of notes. But now when I get this one, A7, then I have to think about what Bart was talking about. Okay, we set the stage, we create a condition for something to emerge, cool conversations, and we have to open up to cosmopolitan communication, blah, blah, stuff like that. So, okay, I got this one. When I see this A7 thing, of course I have to know this is an A7, or this, or this, or this, or this, all kind of variations. And then I know these, but then I engage in the conversation, in the jamming. So I just cannot know what to do, because I have to take turns with the other people, and I have to accompany the people. So Sergej is a wonderful saxophone player. You might not know that, but he might play something like that, and he plays that note. I might be accompanying him, and I play something like this, and I hear that note, and I play suddenly, and then he plays syncopation, and I play with him. So I play with him, I'm accompanying him, and I just got this as a minimal structure. It is very important that I have this structure. I have to know something about structure, process, whatever, to engage into a jam with other people, to get some conversational jamming or conversational jazz happening. So CMM for me is about what kind of helpful scaffoldings, ideas, heuristics are can we use to learn to engage in cosmopolitan communication. That's what I wanted to stutter to you.
Wonderful,
Sergej,
Rick. Thank you very much.
You know who the next person is.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Rick. Okay, so much for having set the stage. That was what we intended to do so far. So for those of you who joined us a bit later, we've shared a bit about the CMM Institute, about CMM, about our fellows program, and about the role of metaphor in CMM. And that should set the stage for short presentations by our fellows about this year's theme, Overcoming Polarized Narratives. So I'm going to share the presentation again, if I can find it. Just one sec, please. There we go. And let me share my screen. It has a bit of trouble with that. Just a sec, please. And now I'm back at it again. Yes. There we go. So we have 3 fellows presenting today. Ralph Banks personally couldn't make it, but he gave me a slide and a few words on his behalf to share with you. So I'll do that last. But first, I'll give the stage to Roger to share about his project. Roger, can you introduce yourself and share your thoughts about your work? You're on mute, Roger. We can't hear you yet.
Oh, let's try that again. I'm Roger Johnson. I'm a PhD doctoral student at Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. And one of the interesting things, the reason why I got into my program was because I was very much interested in CMM. And I come from a background of public relations where we used a different kind of communication model to shape our work. And my advisor here is John Perry Sproul. I don't know if many people have heard of him. I know some people have. He's been working with CMM for quite some time. So let me start off with how this research project came about. When we started with the pandemic, I found myself kind of thrust between 2 different worlds. On the one hand, I was in the world of people in my program and at the university who were very well versed on public health, health communication, and these types of subjects. And very quickly, we started having conversations about whether we should wear masks or not. And then we began to see media, we began to see Dr. Fauci talking about mask wearing in some different instances, and the messaging that was coming out of that was inconsistent. But nonetheless, most of my friends and colleagues in the university and around me began to wear masks. We began to purchase them and wear them when appropriate. On the other hand, I have a group of friends that go all the way back to my childhood that saw a different perspective. And I noticed very quickly that they began having conversations with me about mask wearing and about their decisions not to wear a mask for a number of different reasons. And those conversations have continued even to this day. Many of them still have not decided to wear a mask, and many of them unfortunately have contracted COVID-19 and have recovered in some cases, and in other cases they have not recovered. So that's kind of the foundation for where I wanted to go with this particular research. So my research question really comes down to this. how do anti-compliance and anti-containment mask-wearing behaviors emerge from the stories told and the stories lived and storytelling in the current COVID-19 pandemic? And so I'm coming at this from a CMM perspective, in which CMM directs us to directs our attention to the reflexivity of resources that shape and guide the practices that we have in our life. And resources are the stories that we tell each other and the conversations that we have, and practices are those things that we do that emerge out of the stories that we tell each other. In addition to that, in my work here at IUPUI, we also inform CMM through research in interpersonal neurobiology, particularly that research done by Dan Siegel. And my advisor has said a few times that communication is in fact bioactive. And that bioactivity means that the energy that we share with each other is communication. And in that communication, we can find more integration, both embodied and in relationship with each other. And when we have good integration, we can make better decisions about the things that are happening in our lives. And so the methodology that I am using for this particular study is to primarily use the loop model, the hierarchy of meaning, and generative questions and narrative interviews to begin having deeper conversations with participants who choose not to wear masks or who are opposed to mask wearing in this current pandemic. And so I have a little sample of data that I've collected. One of my participants said this. She said, mask wearing is a violation of my freedom. And then she goes on to say that I think, and then also I just don't think they work. She says, she continues to say that a lot of stuff says it does, but then some doesn't. And what's interesting about Amy's story is that when the pandemic started, she was pro-mask. Not only was she wearing masks, but she was making masks for other people, and she was promoting mask wearing. We could call her a mask evangelist, if we want to use that metaphor. But something changed. What was that change? And we see, first of all, that she mentions freedom. We also see that she might have been reading more data and more information out there about masks and consuming different kinds of media that might have changed her mind. And so there might be a moral injury there to her freedom, first of all, and that has its own story. And there might be a story there about other information that she's reading out there, because there is a plethora of it that says that masks aren't working, whether that is information that is spread through social media or traditional media, or even in some of the research journals. And so really, because I'm an applied researcher, what I want to find out from this study, at least in the sense of people who don't wear masks, is how might better patterns of communication improve integration and well-being to foster healthier and empathetic choices to support better pro-social health and mask-wearing behaviors. Now, I don't have an answer for that yet because I'm still in the middle of my research, but that's where I am, and it's been pretty exciting. And the conversations that I'm having with people like Amy are quite enriching in their own right.
Wonderful, Roger. Thank you for sharing this overview of your work, and for all of you participating. Any questions or ideas that this services with you, please hold on to those or write them down so you can take them into the small group dialogue we'll have later. So thank you, Roger.
Sergej, Sergej, can I just point out a conceptual question that someone put out, which is, what is the loot model? Roger, would you elaborate on the acronym and say a couple of words? Because I think it would help in the small group conversations.
Oh, sure. So the loop model has a lot to do with stories and the conversations that we have. So there's storytelling, that's the stories that we tell each other. There's the stories that we live, those activities that we do, and then there's stories told that are a history of what we've already done. And those are reflexive with each other. In other words, they inform each other and create each other over and over again. In addition to that, there's a whole other side to the loop model of untold stories, unheard stories, untellable stories, and I'm missing the fourth one.
Oh, they just keep coming, and they just keep coming, undiscussable, and we could go on, but that, I think that's a great frame for whoever asked the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So the acronym is lived stories and all the unheard, unknown, etc. And the T is for stories told, right? And these unheard stories are in between.
Storytelling.
Yeah, to answer Linda's follow-up question. So there may be more questions about the specifics of CMM that emerge for you, as you are not that familiar with the methodology yet. And we'll make a point of sharing additional resources that you can explore to learn more about CMM after our session as part of the resources we make available. All right. Well, thank you again, Roger. And Teresa, can I give you the stage to share about your research?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sergej. And thank you to everybody that's on the call. It's made me feel so welcome in this community. One of my first experiences of face-to-face meeting with a lot of these folks was a learning exchange I attended in Arizona, I believe. And just being there and walking in the first night, I don't know for many of you, but when I've walked into new communities at conferences, workshops, it takes a while. It takes a couple of times to actually feel welcome. But with the CMM Learning Exchange, I felt welcome from the get-go, right from the first minute. And I have felt all the way through. So my dissertation, I've just graduated in 2020, and I looked at older adults. The polarized narrative that I was looking at was the change that we've had in Western societies in terms of our response and our expectations of the roles of older adults. So in especially individualistic cultures, older adults have been segregated from their communities. There are retirement villages, there's separation between older adults and younger people where there might not have been before. I followed 9 older adults who were known to be highly wise, transcendent, and giving, caring in their communities, nominated as such by their communities. And what I found was that these particular older adults in 3 different communities in the province of British Columbia, Canada, from rural to urban communities, were bucking against this polarized narrative that was going on that separated them and put them away from community. And that was quite inspirational. So I have dozens and dozens of transcriptions from my ethnography of the conversations that they had in communities. This particular fellowship has allowed me to not only revisit those conversations, which I did, to see what they were, but to also think about what they would look like in 2045. I think Sergej mentioned that one of the main projects of the CMM Institute is something called Cosmopolis 2045. So what I did over the last few months is I went back to those transcriptions of the conversations that some of these older adults were having. And I not only looked at them for inspiration, but I looked at what they might actually look like in 2045 if the civic structures, the governance, the community places that existed would allow them to be less polarized, less separated from culture. And so that's been a really fun and creative process. I'm working with a crone group. I don't know if you're familiar with the word crone, but it's a revisualization of what women can look like in communities. It's a group I belong to here in my own community. They've been helping me with these narratives. And as I created these first stories and presented them to Robin Penman and Arthur Jensen, who are the authors of the books that Sergej featured in the presentation in the Making Better Social Worlds and Cosmopolitan Communication, I realized that they are actually exemplary of some of the chapters in their books. So Nellie was really demonstrating in her conversations, and by the way, these don't just happen in schools or in community squares, but in Cosmopolis in 2045, elders are everywhere again, and they're not segregated and put in certain places. So Elder Nellie's talking about changing the stories of herself and evolving and being self-reflexive, and same with Mary. And then Elder Chris is leaning into the mystery, and he's actually, through his photography, creating new worlds and other realities that we have not considered. And I very much see them having quite a bit of fun in 2045. Just before I finish, I didn't ask you, Sergej, this, but I'm wondering if you can click on the arrow for the movie for Elder Chris, if you could see the aliveness that is in him and the way he's crossing. So there's a little, yeah, I don't know if you do that, if we hear Chris, just a couple of seconds. We need the volume.
It's gonna be something else. Oh God, look at the snow in here.
I think
There he is in his,
you
was
didn't
fine.
hear the audio, I think, right? Yeah.
No, we heard
He
it.
was
Thank
just-
you.
Oh, you heard it. Okay, great. Just
Yeah,
checking.
thank you. Yeah, he's just, you can hear the aliveness in this man who's standing in the middle of a snowstorm, through his camera, seeing alternate worlds and so alive in community. So thanks for this opportunity to be a fellow and to be part of Cosmopolis. And I'll turn it over to, I think Matt is going to follow me, my fellow.
Oh,
Thanks, Teresa. And thanks, Sergej. Hey, everyone, I'm Matt Taylor. I'm honored to be here and to be a CMM Institute fellow this year. And my work has been focused on overcoming polarized narratives through mutual aid in the time of COVID. So first off, what is mutual aid? There is a very rich history of mutual aid and how it's been practiced, especially in Indigenous communities and communities of color in the United States. I don't have time to get into that rich history right now. So what I will simply say is that mutual aid is a local city or neighborhood level structure in which communities come together around a very simple principle. Everyone has things that they need and everyone has things that they can offer. And it's up to the community to work together to meet everyone's needs unconditionally with the things that we can offer each other. And mutual aid groups have kind of been ballooning in existence since the pandemic started in March in the US, or became more exacerbated in March in the US, as social systems have been overwhelmed by, and yes, someone just shared in the chat, the term was coined by Peter Kropotkin in the late 1800s. But these groups have been forming and kind of just ballooning in existence since the start of the pandemic taking hold in the United States, as social services have been kind of overwhelmed with higher amounts of need and people just not being able to have their needs met as much. And communities have been coming together everywhere to meet those needs. I myself, I live up in the greater Boston area, and I work with a mutual aid group in Somerville and Medford, which are right outside of Boston. And as I've been doing work with these mutual aid groups, my work is focused on setting up support systems for folks to find supports they need, and then also creating these local neighborhood level, block level networks where they can be in communication with each other and with their neighbors about things that they need and things that they can offer. And as I've been sort of partaking and helping set up those structures, I've really come to see how, you know, this is starting conversation with people who you don't know from a completely different perspective than we're used to, especially when it comes to talking about things like civic engagement and community engagement. And so as a consequence of my work there, and the thing that I focus on as a CMM fellow, I came to this question of, in what ways do mutual aid groups serve as foundational structures for cosmopolitan communication? And what methodologies could strengthen this foundation further? Cosmopolitan communication being what was referred to earlier, I think by Barton, around finding foundations that move across identities for communication to, especially in the realm of Cosmopolis 2045, serve as civic dialogue spaces for the future of governance models from the community level and from the participatory level. And so a lot of what my research focuses on is on these neighborhood pods and how they can be used to build relationships. While they exist in a way that starts from a really solid place of just starting with a new question to explore around helping each other rather than what's your existing political identity or what's your existing identity around social need. It starts from how can we help each other? And it requires a lot of building on to really build trust in a way that people can be vulnerable with each other. So I'm currently exploring, what are some ways and some tools that we can introduce to help really strengthen that trust among local communities, to overcome polarized narratives, around political identity, around social service needs and identity, in a way that can serve for a better civic dialogue space in the future.
Wonderful, Matt. Thanks for sharing your research with us here. And also thanks to you, Roger and Theresa. Three very different takes on the theme that offer myriad possibilities for further exploration and application. So as a next step and leading up to our interactive, to the interactive part of our workshop, I will share Ralph, who couldn't be with us, very briefly. So he used the metaphor of Aikido to look at overcoming polarized narratives, with a central metaphor of ki, which is an Eastern word for energy. And rather than seeing energy as confrontational or letting energy impact you, Aikido, as Ralph shared it with me, means stepping into the energy itself, metaphorically, but also physically, as communication is bioactive, as Roger shared with us. And then working with the energy not to hurt yourself and not to hurt your opponent. So that's the whole idea, a founding idea of Aikido. And Ralph is working, how can we, from a centered position, use this idea of stepping into the energy, working with the energy, as a way to create different forms of conversation with people that we disagree with, where the idea is to both not get hurt. So having said that, I will ask Ilene, Beth, and Bart, each in turn, to reflect on what our fellows shared and to generate some questions that we can then all use in our small breakout groups to have a conversation about. Ilene?
Thank you, Sergej. As I was listening and I was thinking about the question about what are the contexts that are informing people's values and choices. So I think about that across all four of the projects that were introduced. And I also think about what are we hearing in the storytelling, and in particular, not only what are we not hearing and what are the stories that we don't know, that if we did know them, they would enhance how we are engaging and our capacity for cosmopolitan communication. But also, what are the stories that we can learn about that will help us go on together?
Yeah, so I was going to add that when you think about energy and flow, it's very relational. And each one of these projects is showing relationships between and amongst different people. And what that does is it really gives a sense of recognition and affirmation that people's stories are being heard. They're giving opportunity to tell what the stories are, and it's very engaging. And if you can imagine, I mean, a million years ago when I lived in Japan, I studied Aikido, and one of the things I like about it is it's not an offensive martial art. It's more about somebody comes at you and they attack you with their energy, and there are different ways of responding to that energy, right? So the Aikido is a very flowing circular kind of motion. So you're taking that energy and you're recirculating it and rechanneling it, which is, wouldn't that be beautiful if our communication was like that? And then when when somebody comes at you with a very polarizing point of view, if you're able to turn that around in there. And that happens with elders in the story that Teresa was telling, because unfortunately in a lot of our societies, we discard what is old instead of relishing it and valuing the wisdom. It's that the mutual aid, people all need something and all have something to give. And it's such a nice feeling to be able to give something where you're relevant. And then Roger, and that's the polarized conversation that we've had so much in this country about, what some people shake their heads and say, but it's just basic healthcare. And people say, well, it's not only about basic healthcare, it's about all these other things that happen. So just leave it at that. And Bart? You're on mute, Bart.
Bart, you're mute.
Sorry about that. I'd like to build on what Ilene said about going on together as being one of the most important things for us to consider in asking the questions, and add a little more framing about the CMM fellows this year, as we looked at polarizing narratives and how to overcome those. And we saw that the proposals that we had from the fellows really came out in 3 different categories. One was looking forward to how do we make better social worlds. And we have a demonstration project on our website called Cosmopolis 2045. And so it's a thought experiment. We'd like to invite everyone to participate in that thought experiment in different ways, either today or maybe later, in the sense of what would the world be like in 2045 if we don't blow it up by being polarized, and how would we co-create a way that is more cosmopolitan in its the way that we communicate and interact with each other. What does that look like? What does it feel like? So, CMM is kind of heavy in the philosophy and in the theory sometimes, but we really wanted to bring it to life by envisioning how we would be together in a future type of way. And so our fellows, we heard from 2 that are themed around Cosmopolis and how Cosmopolis would look differently. And that was Matt's presentation and Roger's. But Teresa also touched on the peace and polarized narratives. How do we bring I'm sorry, Rogers was in the peace and polarized narrative category, in the sense of how do we change the way we communicate about things that we need to do together so that we have more of a coherent feel about doing them. But the one we didn't hear from was the Cosmo Kids, or how do we train and teach children now, today, in today's world, in a way that they interact with each other and with the rest of the world in a way that leads to a more coherent way of being together. And so it emphasizes those aspects of social constructionism that the children probably can't pronounce social constructionism, but they can understand that they can soar together by loving each other and responding to each other in ways that are informed by kindness and our common humanity. And so that's, again, the timing and the temporal nature of how do we go on is really shaped by looking back. And this is the last theoretical point I want to make, is one of the things that CMM teaches is that a lot of what we do today is not shaped by what's our relationships in the moment, but it's something that happened in the past. It created a context, it creates a contextual force, it creates a logical force that causes us to behave in a certain way, even if we really don't want to do it. And the term for that is an unwanted repetitive pattern, or URP. So our question then is for us to ask each other maybe today in our breakout rooms is, how do we intervene in unwanted repetitive patterns in a way that we are together at a given moment, so that our future, the mystery that's in the future at a higher level of context, has a chance and an opportunity to emerge, instead of the pattern that we know we don't want.
Great. Thank you, Ilene, Beth, Bart, for reflecting on those presentations and sharing some questions that we can take into our breakout rooms. Well, we're about to go into those. Before we do that, 2 or 3 points of order. I see that we are now short to the hour. We have until 1/2 the hour, so I want to give us 20 minutes for this breakout conversation together. So we have another 10 minutes to reflect back on those and wrap up. We have not been able, given the size of our participation and also knowing who will participate, to create groups beforehand. So you will be given a breakout room at random. So it'll be surprising with whom you will find yourself in a minute. We'll make breakout groups of 4 so that in your 20 minutes, you'll each have some time to interact, reflect, and share with each other what you want to share. Some of our fellows will be present in rooms. In some, there will be no fellows, so it'll be a bit chaotic. But we hope, knowing our fielding audience, that you can deal with that. And having said all that, there's a final thing I want to offer. If you want to make use of that, that's a Google Jamboard. I'll share the link to that right here in the chat of our Zoom call. If you click on that, you find yourself on a Jamboard where you could make some notes, share some stickies, draw something if you want to doodle something. But that's a possibility, not something I require of you. So if you want to, you can use that. Any urgent questions before I hit the breakout rooms? No? All right, let me prepare them. I'll make 10 of them, and then I'll see you back, or I'll bring you back at 10 before 1/2. Have fun, enjoy.
It's a treat to see you.
This is what happens informally in the hotel.
I know.
Yeah, exactly.
I know.
Yeah.
We should just have an alumni hangout.
Yeah. All right. So everybody's coming back slowly to the main room. And then in a few seconds, everybody will be forced out of their rooms. That's a benefit of virtual technology, by the way, especially in fielding sessions.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Hi, Mickey. Good to see you. It's been a long time. Yeah. Hi.
Sergej, Ilene recommended I share my link to my mass study to the folks here in the group. Is that okay?
Yes, please. Yeah. Use the chat. Yeah.
All right. I'll wait until everyone gets back in and then we can send it out.
All right. So the rooms are closed. Everybody should be back by now. So I wanted to deal with our last few minutes in the following way. There's too many of us to go around, unfortunately. So I wanted to ask our fellows, our presenting fellows first, to share some of what they've learned from their conversations. And then on a first come, first serve basis, let you add your voices to that. And in our final minute, let's open up all mics and say, give each other a big virtual hug before we leave. So Roger, can you share a few of your thoughts about the conversation you were in? Yeah,
so one of them I thought was interesting was the whole idea of building trust or tearing down trust, and how that might help or hinder us in our conversations with folks who may not want to wear masks for any number of different reasons. I think that when we also show thankfulness for their views, even when we don't necessarily agree with them, and approach people with a more gracious and merciful disposition, that energy, I think, creates an ecosystem of resonance, of receptivity to open those conversations about not wearing a mask and why people are doing that. And I shared one story where in one of my conversations, COVID went through the family. Someone in the family did not make it through COVID. And now the person I've been talking to is wearing their mask, but they're only wearing it up to their nose and not over their nose. And that still poses some problems. So that, and then if anyone is interested in my study and directing participants to it, I'm going to share a link to the web page that I'm using so that you can read more about it, and then perhaps even share that among your friends and families and in your community, so that I could generate more participants for this study. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Roger. Theresa?
I have to unmute myself. A little pause there. Well, I got to meet Dr. Milton Lopez, who was a colleague of Barnett's when they were both teaching at Fielding. And he's interested and came to join with us today because he's interested in Barnett's spiritual directions. He's, since retiring, has written a book, and I put that onto the Jamboard there for anybody that's interested. And then the two of us went and joined, I think, group 9. So we became a group of 5. And we found some resonance there together on our common being in the later half of our life, or the last, what they call maybe the 3rd or 4th age, the resting place, the human love being divine love place, that no matter how we're presenting that, Dr. Page has a book as well that I also put onto the Jamboard, or Isabel, who has been attending the Parliament of World Religions, and she saw Crownness there, that word. I mentioned that I'm a crone and I'm a member of a crone group, and she saw that word used for the first time in a very positive way at that Parliament. So it was just nice to have that being in our resting place commonality and the spiritual investigations, and to share that together and that aspect of CMM.
Wonderful. Thank you, Theresa. And I put a link to the Jamboard in the chat for those who want to navigate there, and we'll download it and share it as part of the resources to follow up on our session. So you can revisit that later. Matt?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be with Tracy and Linda, and it was a really nice conversation. Just you know, similar to what Teresa said, just like getting to know each other, you know, finding commonalities amidst a lot of our work, and just diving deeper into making meaning of CMM, which I feel like is appropriately meta to make meaning of the framework that's for making meaning. So it was really fun, especially just to kind of like, you know, really sort of get into what it looks like, you know, how it's used in practice, how that relates to the theoretical lens, and you know, certainly useful for me as well in my own work. But it was just really nice as well to see how that kind of related to a lot of the work that we do, and how we overlap a lot in the social equity aspect of the projects that we're working on.
Thanks, man. All right. So anyone else who wants to add their voice to the reflections in the last few minutes? Please just unmute yourself and speak if you want to. And sitting with all this rich material in silence is also a beautiful way to wrap up our session. So that's fine too. I enjoy it at least. So moving slowly, not to interrupt anyone who would still take a chance. So feel free to still interrupt me. I would like to finish today's being together with a virtual sort of connection if you want to. So if you would put your hands like this in front of your camera, you sort of touch the hands of the other in some way. If communication is indeed bioactive, as I would like to believe, then we are resonating and creating a circle of Fielding and fellows all together. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your thoughts, ideas, and spirit, and to be continued. Have a great conference. And thank you, Fielding, for organizing us.
I want to thank you, Sergej, for all you did to organize this and for the fellows that keep us all going.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Same here.
Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.